Everyone. Welcome to round two of the New Zealand Schools Debating Championship. Congratulations to both of you for so far. Do you have the motion yet? All right. The motion for this round is this House believes that for most personal relationships, e.g. family, romantic, friendship, how they end matters more than how they lasted. Speaking time for 7 to 8 minutes with POI between the first and 7th minute. So I'll clap once at 1 minute, once again at 7 minutes and twice at 8 minutes. Reply speeches are 4 minutes long. I will clap once at 3 minutes and twice at 4 minutes. So my name is Ben. I use he, him pronouns. I'll get the rest of the panel to introduce themselves as well, and then I'll get you all to introduce yourselves and your pronouns as well, if you feel comfortable and if you can see in live stream. So, yep, my name's Ben. My pronouns are he, him. So, I'm Jaden, and I'll be sharing.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm first chance and I use he and pronouns and I can set in live stream.
Hi, I'm Natalie, second and reply, and yeah, I can see the live stream.
I'm Charlie. I use he, him. I'm third speaker and I consent to being live streamed.
I'm Ashika, I speak first and reply. She, her pronouns, because I'm recording.
My name is Sean. I speak second. My pronouns are he, him, and I consent to being live streamed.
I'm Dario. I'm speaking says and I consent.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I now invite the first speaker of the affirmative team to begin what we do today.
Sorry, for the live stream, is there everything showing on the screen or is it just meant to be the desktop?
Just desktop, because I'm not going to be distracted looking at this stuff.
Our relationships are the most important things in our lives. They are what make us human. Our relationships with our family, our friends, our personal relationships, these are the things which matter to us. They influence our growth, they influence our lives, they influence our well-being, they influence our feelings and our thoughts. We don't have to believe that all these relationships ultimately come to an end. This is provable because, well, ultimately we all die, so there must be an end eventually. And we believe that how these relationships end are the most important thing in terms of how they matter. Okay, so 3 things to this speech. First, on setup, secondly, on retrospect, and thirdly, on continued relationships. Okay, so setup. What is a relationship? So we believe a relationship to be a bond between individuals. Typically, how these relationships work is they begin either being born into your family, of course, or you meet someone, you talk to them, you bump into them at school, and a relationship can begin to form. Now, these relationships, they develop over time, and what we see is that in the vast majority of cases, over time in a relationship, you see more of how a person is, you see more of who they are, what they stand for, how they are going to act. So, how do these relationships end? So we see that there are a few pathways. So obviously, one of what we believe to be one of the minority pathways is death. Then there's also a mutual amicable parting of ways, or a positive ending, as we will refer to it throughout this debate, or a harmful, usually one-sided, non-amicable parting of ways, or a negative ending, as we will continually refer to it. So why do relationships matter to people? So people invest in relationships. They invest time, money, feelings, and love, and people get attached to relationships. They form an emotional bond, and as humans, we are emotional creatures, obviously, and we like to invest in these relationships, and we ultimately grow attached. So, and how do people? What happens after a relationship ends? So people typically look back on a relationship. They move on with their lives, but how they move on in their lives is significantly impacted by how the relationship ends and not how it was, and that's what we'll continue to prove for this way. So, on retrospect, first main point. A little bit of context. So, a relationship either has a bad ending, as I said, or a good ending. So this will look like domestic violence, cheating, or someone not giving effort, or toxic relationships for a bad ending, or for a good ending, alternatively. It could look like a mutual decision that things aren't working. It could look like people drifting apart, or any other logical, agreed upon reason that both partners feel is a reasonable way for a reasonable thing for the relationship to end. So, 2 main mechanisms here. This is what does the retrospect look like in a good ending, and what does the retrospect look like in a bad ending to a relationship? And why does this matter more than how the relationships evolved over time. Okay, so good ending. You've just agreed to part ways amicably, or one of the other good endings you discussed. So what happens when you reflect on this relationship? You look back on the relationship, and ultimately you see because the relationship ended well, you're allowed to see the other things that mattered. You're allowed to see it through the lens that things went well, and at least you can look back on it without things being tainted. We'll get on to the comparative and negative ending next episode. No, thank you. And additionally, but what we're saying is that the things which happen in a relationship only matter when you look at it in a positive light. I mean, everything is how it's painted, and that is why the ending must matter, because it is how you reflect on things. It's the lens through which you view things, and ultimately you cannot argue things can be looked back on without looking through the lens of how things ended. Because as we said, and we'll continue to prove that state, how things ended is often, most often, the true state of what people are. The truth is this person's becoming the most like themselves to you, and also that is what matters in a relationship, because we want people to be themselves, and who they are is what matters. Okay, on to the second main reason. What does retrospect look like in the case where, no thank you, a negative ending? Okay, so for instance, one of the partners cheats on the other in a romantic relationship. So people remember these bad things, right? When they look back in a relationship, they do not think about things having fallen. They think about this person cheated me. This person does not deserve my trust, because ultimately their final state is something which cannot be trusted. They have shown to you that they are a type of person who is not the right type of person.
It's feel like.
No, thank you. And we ultimately believe that these bad things is what people remember. And ultimately, in retrospect, when you think about the relationship, you will see how you feel at the end, and that is how what matters. This is most often the true self of the person who you're in a relationship with. And this is likely when you see who they really are. And it's and just like further prove that that's why they really are. It's like, it's difficult to keep an act up the more time invested in a relationship. So at the end state of the relationship is how they are most likely to be their true self. So a couple of short-term harms of when a relationship ends negatively. So that means that you are ultimately going to be saddened, you're going to have broken trust, you're going to have all these negative impacts on your mental health, because you have been shown that the harms to how the relationship impacts you dramatically in that way. And ultimately, long term, you realize that the person who I am, no thank you, I'll be taking a PY after I finish this point, and we will be looking at the emotional states of the person in the short term, and as well as the long term retrospective analysis of how the relationship was. That ultimately the end impacts more than what happens about the relationship, because it provides a lens through which to view the rest of the relationship, and that means that ultimately that's how it should be viewed, because that's who the person really is. I will now take a PY as team. So
You say that things only matter when you look at it in a positive light. Do abusive relationships not matter because they're not looked back on positively?
Well, ultimately, with abusive relationships, there's either two cases. It either begins abusive, and it could end. Oh, it's actually four cases. It begins abusive, ends positively. It begins abusive, ends negatively. It begins okay and then ends abusively, or it begins okay and ends okay, in which case there's an abusive relationship. So only three cases. But okay, in the case where it begins negatively, then obviously and ends negatively, obviously that's going to be a harmful thing. You're going to look back on it and just ultimately doesn't matter. If it ends positively, you can at least look back and remember the good things, but you will still remember the bad things. It's not saying that you won't remember the bad thing. We're ultimately saying that, well, firstly, in the majority of cases, don't end in abuse. There's statistics based on that, and it's not in the majority of cases, which is what this debate is about. But also, when you're looking back on it in positive, no, thank you. When you're looking back on it through a positive lens, like it ends positively. You can still see things clearly, you can still see the wrongs, but at least you aren't getting the harms of a bad breakup on top of that. It's not going to end necessarily by them punching you and you have to go and just it's hiding or some sort of welfare program just to avoid them. At least it's going to end slightly better for the person. That's why the ending must matter. Okay, so quickly on to the second point, and that is continuing relationships. So two mechanisms too. So when you see them, you remember how things were. I've run into the street, if you run into the work, if you run into them through another kitchen, this means that people are you're going to bring that memory relationship. You're going to view it through the lens of the end. And if ultimately what we're telling you is that the end affects how you view the relationship, the end affects how you view this person, because it's who they really are. And that's why it must matter. And second thing is that the end affects whether a relationship can be continued in the future after it ends. Because if it ends negatively, it's ultimately going to impact whether you want to continue the relationship when you see them again. It's also because If it ended negatively, you're going to think of it in that negative light, which means we're not going to do. If it ended positively, then there's at least a chance. But in that case, it's the ending that impacts that, not what happened before. So outcomes, relationships can be continued if ended well, but not if ended poorly. That means the end must matter. And the impacts of that, it ultimately, the person can be happier if they want to continue the relationship. They can have the choice and they have a more accurate idea of the person who they're approaching. So ultimately, what we tell you on Affirming Team is that the end of the relationship provides a lens from which to view the relationship, and that is the ultimate true form of the person, and that is why we're very proud to stand. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for the speech, and now welcome up the first speaker of the speaker.
Look, if affirmative stands for development of an individual and growth, we have to get the win because we're the only side that are able to claim this. 4 things to do in this speech then. Firstly, on some general rebuttals. Secondly, on setup. Thirdly, on the quality of relationships. And fourthly, on the impacts to the individual. Firstly, then, on a general point. On a general response, but note that most of my rebuttal will be integrated throughout the speech. I think firstly then on the blatant mischaracterization of individuals within relationships and their like responses to breakups, right? They tell you that when you see things in a positive light, you're way better able to like move on from relationships and get the better happy ending that you need. I think 2 types of conflicts in this. Firstly, on bad relationships, and then secondly on good relationships. I think I've proved to you later down the line why this works, but even if the ending is super good, if you are able to look at things in a positive light with rose-colored glasses and say, this person is good, this relationship is good at the end of it, despite the challenges faced throughout the relationship, that is when you lose out on personal growth and the ability to change and grow and move on as people. Firstly, then on setup. Firstly, on relationships, we agree that like mostly relationships are complex and that both parties contribute to the relationship to agree and the unwinding and the formation and maintenance of relationships. I think how we get better relationships on our side is when we tell you that we're better able to develop them at the point at which we don't contingent the entire meaning of the relationship based on the end, which is just one of the factors that led to its end. Secondly, then on the meaning of relationships, I think firstly what gives relationship meanings. I think firstly the perception of the relationship of yourself and the person within the relationship, but also the individual interactions all throughout the relationships that you have with the person and how this forms your bond and how it allows you to develop as a person. I think relationships are quite important as humans are social creatures, and relationships don't just serve as catharsis, they also serve as improving yourself as a person. And when you're unable to move on from a relationship, that's the point at which you're harmed. Then secondly, on endings, they tell you, I think endings to relationship are often a huge like last resort. You're not going to end a relationship if you think that you can still be able to interact with that person positively, like, right? So 2 ends in a relationship. Firstly, on a bad ending where you go no contact because you think the person is abusive and harmful to your mental health. But then secondly, on a good ending where maybe you exchange pleasantries from time to time, you probably still don't want to interact with that person anyway, or else you wouldn't have ended the relationship. I don't see how you're still able to have positive interactions with this person other than you exchanging pleasantries. Firstly, then on the quality of relationships. I think relationship end due to a range of factors. Often the ending is just the last resort that cuts the individuals out of their relationship. When you prioritize the ending, you only look at the one major factor that led to the end of the relationship. There are huge catalysts throughout the relationship that contribute to the ending. Humans have inherently short-term thinking, where they largely to inflate this one particular issue that led to the end, rather than to assess critically what each and every like interaction and how that led to the end of the relationship. Why is this important then? Because I think that duration then has just way more impact on your ability to be able to grow as a person. If you find out at the end of the relationship is your partner cheating on you, but you think that this is a huge harm and you're likely to distrust people later on down the line, right? But when you get on our side, when you think about the duration of the relationship, as you look at the signs and you look at the harms that led to you like falling apart, right? You look at like the lack of communication that you had, and you look at you ignoring signs that this person has clearly been mistrustful for you. What you look at on their side of the house at your partner cheating is you just constantly distrust people based on certain characteristics that they have. Secondly, I'd have this reduces the quality of relationships as a whole, because even in your happiest moments in the relationship, they're overridden by the outcome of the relationship. You're not able to look at the relationship in a positive light at all, right? Because it's ended. It clearly meant there was a conflict big enough to be able to stop it. Humans look at like the baseline, like the last impact did they feel, right? You don't think about the positive interactions that you had where this person has helped you through a mental health struggle, where you have gone through depressive episodes, rather you look at them ending the relationship based on abandoning you. Why is this important? Because you don't get the self-reflection that they claim you do, right? Humans are you're way more likely not to take accountability for your own actions, because it's easier for you to blame the end of the relationship or the person just being generally bad rather than you looking at every single response, right? I think what is an example of how a relationship develop? I think firstly, for example, if you're like a queer individual in a queer relationship and you have this relationship that's allowed you to come out and have huge experiences and confessions, this relationship is hugely development to your growth and to you being able to navigate your sexuality. Once this relationship ends, you look at that whole experience in a negative light. You look at it as more of a trauma rather than a building experience. Maybe the relationship ended because you went to 2 different universities, but rather than you looking at the outcome as just another factor that contributed to the debate, you like look at the relationship as inherently doomed from the beginning because you likely had different characteristics that allowed your life pathways to split apart. What this means then is you further reduce the quality of relationships. When you break up, you think that like obviously the relationship had flaws to begin with because obviously this defines the entirety of a relationship. When you look retrospectively, which is what they talk about the most, you don't see the huge impacts they want you to see, right? You see the last impression that you have of the person. Why we explain to you why this happens throughout the relationship. Yeah. And then secondly, in future relationships, but like once you break up with this person, you likely take into their characteristics and think this is the catalyst of the relationship ending. These are the characteristics that I want to stay away from. So you're likely to not to have relationship or befriend people that have similar characteristics to the person that like the relationship ended with, because you think the ending of the relationship is inherently because the baseline was really weak and you weren't even able to connect to them in the first place. What this means is you take less accountability for your action, you develop less meaningful relationships because you only look at the people that like are the most similar to you, and therefore you think you're going to have the best outcome of a good like relationship with them, where it's not going to end, right? I'll take that POI.
When you can see that humans have inherently short-term memories, do you not recognize that they're going to remember the end of the relationship most, and that is what's going to be what matters the most?
Explain to you why you looking at the ending of the relationship is bad, right? Because you're not able to develop as a person. Like, I don't think that matters too much. Like, even if you look at it badly and you don't want to interact with that person, we would much rather you have meaningful relationships rather than you being stuck in a relationship where you've already outgrown the person, you've outgrown the relationship, and you just end the relationship, right? But when you get into a relationship, you choose the most similar characteristics to you, that it means you're like stuck in very insular relationships where every reflection of like perception that you're throwing out to the person is likely the same thing that you're getting back. You're probably not developing much from that anyway. But then secondly, on like how they process their feelings on like a good ending. I think when you have a good ending, you're still able to have like undigested feelings, but now you have to interact really good with them. I think for all these reasons, the person doesn't develop, even if it's a good ending. They only get marginal benefits from this because the person isn't developing, the relationship isn't that good. We would much rather the relationship end and look at it in a more reflective way.
Thank the speaker for their speech and invite the second speaker of the affirmative team to continue please.
I think we should boycott maths. Don't you think it can solve its problems with its X all by itself? All right, 4 things I'm going to do in this speech. First of all, a little bit of clarity about what this moot is actually about. Second of all, my substantive contribution to this debate. Thirdly, about retrospect and regret after a relationship. And then fourthly, about meeting someone in the future. So first of all, a little bit of clarification. This debate is about relationships when they've already ended and about whether, like, what matters more to you once they've ended. We kind of hear the negating team pushing like a kind of moral, or this kind of should matter more. This is about what actually does matter more. Because this is not something we can change. This is just arguing about how the workings of relationships in people's minds cause the end to matter more in a relationship. So moving on to my substantive contribution about meeting someone later on. So if you have ended a relationship with someone, or it's been ended, and then later on you see them, this immediately brings to mind why you haven't seen them in a while. So, like, first of all, that matters because your first impression of them is, oh, there's Dave, I broke up with him in high school. And so if your relationship has ended on a really bad note, then, like, I know this is like at the extreme end. We see that you might have to end up working with that person or being in close contact with them, and you're not really going to remember the good times because you're going to be thinking about, oh, this is so awkward, this relationship ended really badly, and now I have to try and rebuild. Because it's hard to get over that kind of bad ending. However, if your relationship ended well, there's a chance to rebuild it again. Like we said, 2 people part on really amiable terms, then they're going to be more likely to be able to work together to improve that relationship. And so we see that this matters more for people later on in their life in case they end up meeting again. So moving on to talking about retrospect and regret. The negating team have told us that when you look at a relationship that's been good and ended well through like rosy tinted goggles, then that's going to stop you from like building growth and wanting to start a new relationship. Now, but we see if you had a really good relationship, but it ended on a bad note, you're actually going to undo all your personal growth from that relationship. And why? Well, that's because you're going to actually look back and go, oh no, this, I thought it was good, but it had such a bad ending. Maybe I didn't grow well, like maybe this person wasn't good for me. And so because we have told you at first how relationships build us up, make us more, what's the word? Oh, there's a word for being stronger, more resilient, and that they can make us, think more about ourselves. But if your relationship has ended badly, you're possibly going to overthink that and undo all of that good. I'll take a PI now.
If a relationship ends really good, but they've still excluded you and made you feel worse, why is rekindling them with them based on a good ending good?
I think it's highly unlikely you're going to have someone treat you that abysmally throughout your whole relationship and then still feel like the ending is like a perfect ending. I just really don't think that happens for the majority of people, which is what this moot is about. We've heard a lot from the negating team about how people don't think about a relationship. People will be in a relationship and they'll be constantly thinking about the end of the relationship if it matters more. This is not a policy moot where we're going to issue a government directive saying to everyone the end matters more for your relationships. Think about it. This is once the relationship's over, people are thinking about the end of the relationship more. And so we don't see that by saying it matters more, people are going to be in their relationship and constantly thinking about the end. The end is the natural end to a relationship. Also, we've told you how they've conceded to saying that humans think quite on the short term, and this actually agrees with our side of the house because people are more likely to remember the end of the relationship because it was sooner. I don't know if you've ever been to the doctor or dentist when you were a little kid and they gave you a lollipop at the end. That's because it's the lollipop that you remember the most because you were like, oh, this is kind of not so bad. But there's actually been scientific studies that have proven people remember the ending of something more. Sure.
If you have a 4-year relationship with someone, are you going to remember the one day where they ended that relationship or the 4 years in which they had that relationship with you?
Well, I'd argue the one day you ended the relationship is like, it's like a culmination of 4 years. Like, that's when your relationship is stripped down. Like, I think it's highly, if you're like, you might like have a perfect relationship and then it ends randomly one day, then that's possibly there was something harmful going on in that relationship, like cheating, like them not actually caring about you. In which case, that bad ending kind of serves as a good thing to make you think, oh, okay, maybe this wasn't such a good relationship. You know, maybe I was being constantly told by this person what I should wear or how I should act, and that wasn't good for me because they're not in control of me. So, well, like when we get to the end of this thing about retrospect and regret, we see that on our side of the house, people view their relationship by looking at the ending, because this is when a relationship's kind of stripped bare. And we see that this impacts our growth from the relationship. Like if you've had this really good relationship and then you've had this horrible ending, like maybe you found out that they were cheating on you, this is going to ruin your memory of the relationship, because this is what people remember the most because of their short-term memory. And this is also going to make you think through, and it's going to like matter more to your perspective of the relationship. And this is good because people are going to think more about, you know, maybe going out with someone in the future and watching for the warning signs. And so they're acutely aware of this bad thing that happened at the end, rather than just being like, oh, there are a few good days in that relationship. And then if it's had a good end, this allows you to fondly remember it. This allows you to rethink through your, like, what made it so good, to maybe allow you to grow for other relationships. And most importantly, you're not going to be rethinking your growth and whether that relationship was actually a good thing. You're more going to be like, you're going to keep that growth. You're going to think on it very carefully. So we see that's when, like, why the end matters the most to your relationship, because that's the lens through which you view your relationship. So finally, talking about meeting someone in the future, the negating team have told us you're less likely to start more relationships with other people if you're thinking about the end of relationships. This is not what this debate is about. It's about proving that the end matters more. And we've told you time and time again, this is how we view relationship, and this is how people work. So I'm so proud to negate.
I think the speaker for their speech and invite the second speaker of the negating team to continue their new argument.
In this debate, there are a couple points of clash. Firstly, what bad endings and good endings look like and the effects of them, as well as in relation to bad relationships and good relationships, as well as if the bad endings are mutual, and the fact that bad endings aren't exclusive to the endings themselves, and all of the harms they claim are symmetrical to a bad relationship, and that the bad endings they claim are actually most likely caused by a bad relationship themselves, and they don't consider how the effects of a good relationship batting endly and how the benefits far outweigh a bad ending. Firstly, they say that a retrospective point of view, if good, matters most. We strongly dispute this, as they fail to consider how it is dependent on the relationship itself. A good ending is only good when the relationship itself wasn't negative. In a relationship of abuse, a good ending means the partner going to jail, because if this person has been abused or manipulated and has been thoroughly harmed, a good ending doesn't mean that these harms are outweighed. A good ending looks like the inflictor going to jail or being punished, and this harm has already been inflicted in a bad relationship, and this is why relationships matter most. Additionally, they also said that a bad retrospect on a good relationship negates any of the benefits. However, we heavily dispute this also on a characterization of bad endings and how they relate to the content of a relationship. A messy breakup is almost always the result of a relationship itself being negative, as no one would classify a chronic cheater as being a good partner who had a good relationship. Also, any harms that AF can claim that bad endings cause mental distress are symmetrical to those in bad relationships. They say that a bad ending will cause them in mental distress and possibly look on the relationship harmfully. However, this claim is symmetrical to relationships and arguably way more impactful, whereas this ending is a single event in a context of a bad relationship where this person is potentially manipulated, or in the circumstance of a child-parent abuse relationship where they most likely can't escape. That timescale is years and years of abuse and much more traumatic, opposed to the single event that they propose. I will develop this point later. Additionally, bad endings in a good relationship instead are much more likely to be less insignificant, as they say. They say that a bad ending will completely negate a good relationship. However, again, as a characterization of those involved in an honest, loving, great relationship, they don't want to actively harm their partner. Overnight, they don't just go and abuse them or assault them. Again, any bad ending or significant harms that they claim are a result of a bad relationship and are therefore a symmetrical claim. So, under the status quo, for a great relationship, an ending instead looks like a loving friend seeing their friend commit a crime or realize a difference in morals which causes them to distance themselves. For this individual, the laughs and joyful moments that they experienced with this friend aren't discounted, yet they experienced a non-ideal ending as they can no longer continue the relationship with this person. However, for this individual, the benefits are not discounted. Again, in a marriage which is full of honesty and respect, which ends up separating maybe due to a difference of morals or a conflict, they still spent years together. They grew together. They may have had a child together which they mutually loved. These years of a good relationship aren't negated by a single bad event, and they fail to mention this. So, I will now move on to my first. I'll take any POIs before I move on.
Do you recognize that all of these experiences that you talk about must be reconsidered in light of the lens of the ending of the relationship, because it tells you something about the person that you would not, until then, not recognized?
If you're saying that a bad ending is only that a bad relationship is only identified through a bad ending, that isn't representative, as a bad relationship still exists. Like, if someone doesn't realize they're cheating and then find out, that wasn't a good relationship, it was a bad one. Therefore, our point still stands. So, on to my first substantive point. Endings don't negate the long-lasting impacts of how the relationship lasted. A traumatic or abusive relationship with a partner or parent isn't negated by them finally being held accountable. The impact of abuse causes long-term psychological damage where, say, someone is physically or sexually abused. This looks like someone going into depression, becoming extremely distrusting and insular, emotionally volatile to triggers, while their worsening mental health may lead them to self-harm. This is a unique harm that we can claim on our side, as in a bad relationship that someone can't escape, as the provided examples of, say, gaslighting, a manipulator, or a child-parent relationship. These impacts cause over a much larger timescale and a much larger volume than they can claim. Therefore, the negative impacts of a bad relationship far outweigh any on the ending, and that is why the content of the relationship matters most. On the comparative, if someone has a fruitful relationship, either with a partner or a parent, and then has a messy ending where there's a falling out due to the timescale difference, the impacts are way different. On one hand, you have a good relationship with a not ideal ending, with the retrospective point of view that you had large benefits. Again, say two people fell in love, they get married, they experience the world together, and have a child that becomes the star of their world, until a disagreement occurs which causes them to split. In their lives, although experiencing that singular bad event, they spent years happy together, grew as people, and produced the child they loved. In this circumstance, it is way more likely that the individual then either remarries or co-parents with now healthier boundaries. Again, A singular event does not outweigh the timescale on which the content of the relationship occurs. On the other hand, let's say there's an extremely abusive, bad relationship between a child and parent where the child is beaten and verbally assaulted. The good ending there is that the parent is being sent to jail and the child relocated. However, instead, that child in their formative years has suffered psychological trauma. They become distrusting of others, never gaining friends, or effectively assimilating back into society. They enter a depressive state, which causes them to have negative self-assessment, possibly leading to self-harm. They become emotionally volatile and susceptible to panic attacks, fated to spend their lives in therapy. Again, this is a harm beneath the content of the relationship as it occurs over a much, much larger time scale. As when in a good relationship, one with respect, love, and empathy, the worst endings don't look like outright assault or manipulation, as those are a product of a bad relationship again. The worst claims and effects they can claim are symmetrical to ours being caused by a bad relationship. Because of this, I think we win alone on the fact that the size of the harm available to be inflicted on our side due to a bad relationship, which can't be mitigated by a good ending, far outweighs any small harm that there is by a bad ending, which ultimately doesn't mitigate the benefits from a good relationship. Additionally, if a relationship has both a good content and good ending, the sentiment of the person doesn't focus on the ending. They focus on valuing the moments that they had. Af cannot claim a non-ideal ending which we have shown as it is symmetrical to both sides. We win because we show you that the bad endings on our side aren't substantial and the effects on our side are much, much more impactful. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for the speech, and I invite the third female to join the
I would like to talk about the situation which the other team themselves have set up. You have spent many, many years, maybe 6 years, in a relationship with someone who you believed genuinely loved you. You have a child together, and you have spent a lot of time developing this relationship. And then there's one argument and it's over. You're no longer with this person, and you have spent 6 years of your life banking on this relationship that is no longer there and is now gone. The other team argues that if a good relationship ends, everyone's just going to be happy because they have spent these years of developing. We argue people are not a monolith. Just because you believe that you as an individual may be happy does not mean the general populace is going to be super happy-go-lucky when their 6-year relationship ends. We would just like to dispute this claim because the other team has been very niggly about the ends of good relationships and what is a good relationship and what is a bad relationship, just to essentially argue that if a good relationship ends, it doesn't matter because you had all of these good points, whereas we argue that a lot of people might feel as though they have just wasted years and years of their life, and we do not believe their disputes necessarily matter. So we see a couple points on our side that have mainly been about respect, continued relationships, and emphasizing that people will mainly just think about the short term. We would like to bring up the fact that we believe is incredibly important. This isn't a policy debate. The other team has argued that, yes, the ending matters most, but it shouldn't. What the first speaker of the other team brought up is that people have short-term memories. They think quickly and they are only going to remember the end for the most part, but that is not how it should be. We are not arguing about how it should be. We are not proposing that we will make it mandatory that people reflect on the overall relationship. We are arguing that this is how people function, this is how they should function, which the other team has agreed with, in admitting that short-term memory is how people think of with relationships, and that they are not thinking with an overall retrospective view. The other team has admitted this and admitted that people realistically are just going to think about how the relationship has ended. So we have emphasized. No, thank you. We have emphasized that there are a couple different options here. There are bad endings, there are good endings to relationships, there's the opportunity for continued relationships. But what our team has emphasized repeatedly is that people are just going to think about the endings. In some cases, the other team, in some cases, we might not think about that, which is what
my first speaker was speaking on when he brought up the fact that in some good endings you might be able to reflect on the overall relationship as a whole. The other team has continued to misunderstand and twist this point to say that we are trying to claim that unless a relationship is good, you cannot reflect, and that reflection only happens within specific circumstances. No, thank you. This is a complete and deliberate misunderstanding. Well, I don't know if it's deliberate, but this is a misunderstanding of our point. They bring up that, so if an abusive relationship ends well, then everything's good and you're happy now and you're able to view it retrospectively happy. That's not what we're arguing. We're arguing that within some cases we can recognize that some individuals may be able to look at relationships within a larger retrospect that does not just reflect the ending. However, we are trying to argue that for the majority of the population, people are going to think about the ending. We feel as though we have developed this very clearly because we have stated that the biggest point of development in a relationship is the end, because you've spent the most time with each other, you have developed that, as my first and second speaker have touched upon. The biggest point of a relationship's development is at the end. The point where you are the most honest with each other is at the end, because at the end you have no incentive to continue to lie to each other about how you truly feel. We believe that this is when relationships are the most honest. This is when we believe people get the most perspective about how the relationship truly was and how they truly feel about it. It's only through the ending of a relationship that the person has no incentive to continue this facade. No, thank you. To continue this facade that the relationship is perfect and happy and they're having a great time. So we believe that we have very clearly shown how people think short term. They are going to think about that end. They're going to think about specifically how that impacts their lives, because as my first speaker has touched upon with the short term, there is a short term, and my second speaker has touched upon, there is a short term where you still have to interact with this person. There is a short term where this impact is felt on your life very clearly, and the impact of the ending of the relationship is going to be the bit that is felt. It is not going to be the majority of the relationship, because once you break up with someone and you still have to sit next to them in class every day, you're not going to be thinking, wow, that was really nice when we watched that movie together that one time. You're going to think it sucks that they are right next to you and you had a terrible breakup. I would now like to take a POI.
Even if it is true that people focus more on the ending, don't you think that years and years of abuse in a bad relationship is more impactful and matters most to be negated?
We can agree that within some circumstances, however, we also would like to look at the nature of abusive relationships, which the other team has not really recognized. Abusive relationships have been shown to escalate over time, so the ending of an abusive relationship is going to be the highest point of abuse, most likely, because that is the thing towards the breaking point. So we would argue that the point of abuse that you've tried to bring up is actually a point on our side, because we can clearly believe that abuse develops over time. You're never going to get into a relationship and they're going to be at their most abusive at the initial part, because the idea that abuse is the worst at the start aligns with the narrative that you can change abusers if you're really nice to them and they love you enough, and we do not believe that that narrative is true. We believe that abuse gets worse over time. The longer you stay, the more dangerous it gets. This has been shown statistically, with specifically women in domestic violence situations. The longer you stay, the worse off you are, in which case the ending is going to be the highest point of abuse. And well, we can agree that within some circumstances, your point is true. We do not believe that this is reflective of the majority of the population, and we believe that we're talking about a very small percentile of the population, whereas we are talking about the majority of the population. So even though we can concede that within some cases, at your best case scenario, this can be true, it is not going to be accurate for the majority of the population, which is what we are talking about here. So we can see that the other team is essentially just trying to argue that it should be like this. It should be like this, or within some specific cases, it is like this. They are not talking about the majority of the population. They are not talking about the way that we actually think about things. They themselves have recognized the way that we think about things is the biggest impact that was felt within our lives, which is going to be the short term. They have, for the most part of the population, they have argued that they themselves have said that people remember relationships on the short term. We find that the reason that this debate maybe not be meshing that well is because we are trying to argue entirely different topics.
Why, Charlie?
No, thank you. We are trying to argue what the moot is, which is that we believe that the end matters more in our current society, where we live, where we are humans, and as it functions. The other team is trying to argue this policy debate where things should be different. We're not arguing they should or shouldn't be different. We are not saying if we agree or disagree with the idea that the end is more important hypothetically. However, we are arguing that as it stands within human nature, the way that we remember relationships and the way that we feel these impacts is going to be short-term. Because yes, we can agree that there may be some long-term impacts for a relationship that will be felt over a long period of time. We believe that in the short term, we have very clearly shown how the ending will be more impactful, and we've also shown that the ending can cloud people's minds, and that for some individuals this may be different. However, for the majority of the population, as the other team has conceded, a lot of people will be clouded with this kind of ending, and they will be fixed on how it ended. The other team has essentially tried to argue that if it ended badly, it's not a good relationship, therefore it doesn't count. However, we would also like to argue that from a person's perspective, they may have had a good relationship. If you believe that you have been in a relationship with your boyfriend loves you the most, you are the most important thing in his world, and then the last couple of weeks he starts going like, kind of like your friend more. Don't really like you. Like if at the end of the relationship the person reveals that they did not care about you, we're not trying to argue whether that's a good or bad relationship because that's not the point. However, we are arguing that if you have had a relationship that you believed was good and you believed was stable the whole time, and then it turns out that they never cared about you in the first place, you are probably not going to really care about those developing points within your relationship because you're just thinking about that retrospect that none of it was true, it was all a lie. It doesn't really matter whether this is a good or bad relationship, which is the only thing that the other team has kind of tried to use to dispute these facts. What we are trying to argue is the impact of this felt, which the other team has not recognized. The other teams themselves have recognized that the short term is what people think about, which is what they have brought up in their first speaker. We have really emphasized that on the short term, the impact of the ending is felt more, and that's why, and on the long term, which is why we are proud to stand.
I've never spoken for this speech, and I invite the third speaker of the negative team can include the substantive portion of it.
Okay, before I begin, I'd like to point out that a great large portion of their material relies on something that they think we said, and I'd like to point out that we actually probably didn't say that, and so it's gonna, yeah. Anyhow, what does this debate really come down to? I think their main push here in this debate is that it provides a lens to view the relationship, and this is why they win this debate, right? Because the ending is kind of like the summation of what's happened in the relationship. I think we have quite a few responses to this anyway. We tell you that, first of all, you would have to have someone who's completely naive throughout a relationship to actually think that, like, this ending just came out of nowhere, came out of the blue. Their entire case hinges on the fact that they didn't probably see it coming, right? I think it also means that, like, even if it is the summation of the relationship, you've still got all those negative actions that have happened throughout the relationship regardless. I mean, just because the ending is kind of like the conclusion of it does not mean that those actions never took place and you can't remember them. I think they also have like a really last-ditch effort here to try to tell us that humans only remember the endings anyway. And I think, once again, we have a few responses to this. It's completely ridiculous. If you are in a 4-year relationship with someone, or you actually have a relationship with your mother or your parents, you're going to remember the relationship with your mother or your parents, not like a few minutes where you've suddenly ended the relationship. All that time suddenly just doesn't disappear because it has ended, right? You've still remembered all the things that have happened in that relationship, and you can look back on it, right? I think that the ending actually requires the journey to get there. You simply cannot have the ending without the journey. And we tell you throughout this debate that because the journey has so much of these actions, that is probably why it's important, right? And even if this was true, that we only do remember the endings, I think we can still win on the fact that you can't have an ending without a relationship, without a lasting relationship. You require a lasting relationship to come to an ending. I mean, they do tell us that all relationships end at death, right? But I don't think that really counts as a real ending to a relationship anyway. I think that you can probably have a lasting relationship without like a conclusive end in sight. So what do we see in this debate, right? I'd like to just to dumb it down for you. Like, VAR is a Polynesian concept that talks about the relationships we hold with one another. When one does a good action towards another, they have a relationship with, strengthens the VAR, and on the comparative, like when one does a negative action, it weakens the VAR. Using this concept, it's clear that no one action can completely destroy and weaken, nor can it completely restore the VAR in total. Whether or not you believe that the VAR is a real, actual concept or not, it still clearly highlights the fact that many actions over a long time mean substantially more than one singular action towards the end. The fact that you've had a relationship with your parents, with your friends, that you've had good times together over many years builds up to a collective action rather than just a few minutes of it ending. I think that you can weigh this extremely highly in the debate because no matter what they try to claim on their side, you're still, to a degree, going to remember all these actions. I don't think that they can claim that we all have the memory of a goldfish and we'll only remember the endings. So even at like our worst case, you still in some way like remember the journey and the journey becomes like a crucial part. Okay. So when we talk about like abusive relationship. When you have a long-term abusive relationship with a partner, it matters more than how it ended. Why is this true? If a woman is raped and falls foul to domestic violence, then her having had enough and ending it by calling the police, this does not matter more than the massive hardship she's gone through. She's gone through trauma in that relationship, and it simply cannot mean more at the end when it has ended than all that trauma she's been through. She has been domestically abused throughout her relationship, so regardless of how it ends, that trauma is still long-lasting and means more. I think we can also apply this with more of like a happier context with friends. You've had good relationships with your friends, and this just doesn't disappear all because of an ending. Okay, like let's use like cereal for an example. Like I used to eat it a lot when I was younger, for many years, but then I stopped because I grew up, right? I don't remember how or when I stopped eating cereal, but I do remember that Fruit Loops tasted really amazing, right? I do remember the fact that they tasted good, and I do remember the fact that that probably benefited me during that time. I don't remember the exact day that it ended, and I don't look at cereal now with some kind of hate that I go, every time I look at you, I've just thought of the time that I've stopped eating you. I think that's kind of ridiculous and can still be applied to relationships. If you look at someone and if you sit next to them during class, you're still going to remember some portion of that time you've had with them. So in total, like let's look at like the path to victory. All we need to prove in this debate is that long-term effects matter more than the short-term ones when having an impact to the individual. So we tell you that regardless if they get a good ending and a good lasting relationship, we still win under the fact that an individual is likely to look back on the good times rather than just the ending. I think whether they have a good ending and a bad relationship, we can still see how it results in lasting trauma. We can see how if it has a bad ending and a bad relationship, we learn valuable lessons to employ later on in life. Lastly, if it's a good relationship and a bad ending, you can still learn lessons and look back on the good times. I think that we tell you even if we don't win one of those points, we still probably bring in enough material to show you that we have to a degree enough material to rebut their points. I think that we tell you, like, for affirming to win this debate, you need to buy all their material and disregard ours, because even if we lose some of our material that we didn't back up all the possible ways a relationship can happen, I think that, like, potential for deeply harmful, like, ramifications of just looking at endings rather than the entire, like, journey, as we've explained, are more harmful than what you would get on our side of the house. So just to sum up this debate in totality, I think that what we hear from them is that their only argument is that, like, you see it through a lens, and then once they know that they couldn't win this point, that they try to tell us that humans only remember the endings. I think that we tell you, regardless if these 2 points are true or not, how we still win, and I think we've already probably told you enough material on how we win these points in total. I am so proud to negate, because clearly it's the only option.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I now invite the leader of the negative to give their replies there.
Two clashes in this debate. Firstly, on retrospect, and secondly, on the types of ending. Firstly, on the retrospect, we tell you throughout the debate from first Nick how retrospect works and how this is a catalyst of events leading up to the end, and how the end is then just insignificant when you think about the huge compacting impacts of it. We tell you the harms of you reducing a relationship down to its end. They overinflate a point and a response on the short-term memory point. I think that negates the fact that we tell you all this material about how when you go through depressive episodes, you think about how the person has supported you through them through each and every single event, rather than you becoming disattached from them and you ending the relationship at a last resort where you feel like you've disconnected from them. I think that is the point that matters the most on retrospect. I think you think about a lot of experiences. We tell you this. We tell you a lot of experiences are way more impactful than you thinking about the one N that is a last ditch resort that we frame to you at first and we carry on at second egg, right? I think that what is the impact of this? We tell you about how these events are a catalyst leading to a bad event, and that's what defines the relationship at the end, not maybe the arbitrary disagreement that happens at the end, but rather the goods or the bads depending on the relation type that it's been, right? That's how you get the most significance out of the relationship, when you're able to develop and grow. They tell you that once you understand the ending, now you just will become a better person because you realize the impacts that it has on you. We tell you how humans develop and grow and how it happens over a span of years, over a difference in experiences that they accumulate with another person and how they're able to interact with them. We tell you that matters hugely more based on the individual experiences that they have rather than one event, that their whole case just hinges around the fact that this impact is going to be so great, it's going to negate all of the experiences that you've lived through the past. We tell you how we told you how humans are social creatures and why they interact with relationships not only for catharsis but also to be able to develop themselves. We tell you that inherently with developing yourselves, this would take every single experience into account. I think the overinflation to a response given for 10 seconds throughout the entirety of the third half speech and the majority of their second speech is probably not that intuitive, right? But then secondly, on the responses to the types of endings, they tell you about a factor of good and bad endings. We tell you that they rely on the fact that if you have a bad ending, this is going to make you feel really bad about it. If you're having a really bad ending, this isn't one event that has led you to break up with this person. This is multiple events where you feel like you're being disadvantaged by them, where you feel like you're being exploited by them. This harm is way more of an emotional stimulus than one day you realizing that you've woken up and this was all a dream and this relationship was really bad. Every day when you wake up in a relationship, there's a catalyst and there's an event where you feel that you're exploited within a bad relationship. That is how you get the most impact in the relationship, and that's how you feel the most within the relationship, and that's how you're able to navigate it, because you know from these learned experiences in the relationship what the telltale signs are of the relationship going bad, even at the low impact where now this is a good relationship that's turned bad. You see the signs throughout the relationship rather than the breakup, which is probably just an arbitrary disagreement, which is the end of everything. But then mostly what does their case contingent on? It contingents on the perfect ending where everyone just realizes at the very end that this was a bad relationship and that is what the defining of the relationship should be. We tell you that defining of the relationship should be is the impacts of every single event and the impacts that would have on you as defining the relationship. When you look at it from one event, you reduce the quality of relationship, even if it's good, and that is when you get the worst relationships.
Speaker for this speech, I welcome up the leader of the affirmative team to conclude.
have a rather vehement dislike of Pam's barbecue sauce. Why? Because one time about 8 years ago, put it on my wrap for dinner, ate my dinner, went to bed, got up a few hours later and threw up. And I haven't liked barbecue sauce since. Now, my short-term relationship with barbecue sauce was really good, just like the third speaker's relationship with Fruit Loops. What's changed how we feel about them now? It's the ending. There was a good ending on amicable terms for the third speaker, whereas for me, it involved a bit of hydrochloric acid. So, what I'm going to go through in this speech, first of all, talk about the weirdness of how niggers kind of frame this as a policy move and then kind of not. Then talk about how this affects our retrospect and how the ending does actually make it matter most. And then kind of look at what we get to at the end of this debate. So first of all, niggers kind of like sometimes frame this as a policy move. Like we've seen them try to prove impacts for people when it's actually not a policy move. This is actually talking about what happens in real life. The winner of this debate is the person who can prove that human nature causes the end of relationships to matter more. So what do we hear about retrospect from the negating team? We hear that this is like dependent on the relationship, and when a relationship ends badly, this is the result of a bad relationship. Yes, but you think of a bad relationship with a bad ending more like harmful than if you had, let's say, like a good relationship where you're like, actually, this isn't working, we need to take a step back. And so it'll, view how you grew during the relationship. It'll change your view of that and also of the person. We've also heard a lot from them like, let's say you had this long relationship with someone, you had kids, you got married, all of that, you had good times, and then you broke up over some small dispute. You're still going to remember the good times. No, you're going to remember the fact you had such good times. They were all ruined by one argument, like your potential for heaps more years. As we've told you at third speaker, that has been ruined. And so that bad ending is going to ruin your thought of the relationship, because all it's going to do is make you think of what you could have had. They've got quite a big push also about like if you're abused in that bad relationship. Whereas they've kind of not listened to our framing we gave you at first speaker. We said like a bad ending was one where, you've got negative feelings for both parties. And I'd argue that someone being taken away in a police car for abusing you is a bad ending. And while it is a result of the relationship, you're going to remember like your relationship through the end, which is, as we've told you, that's where the abuse ramps up the most. And that is going to be like a bad ending to that relationship. But even if you don't buy that, this is still like the negating team's biggest push, and we feel like that's such like a minimal amount of scenarios that we can prove for the most cases it's true that the ending matters the most. So they've also admitted themselves that people have quite a short-term memory. And we're telling you that yes, and that memory tends to focus on stuff that was closer, i.e. the ending of the relationship, and that you're more likely to remember how something ends. And also, the negating team wants you to ignore that little point that came out, I think it was first or second, about how this mattering more is going to stop people from enjoying the good times, as all they're doing is thinking about the ending, because they're a little bit embarrassed that was a policy push from them. So, they've kind of misrepresented the mood. But even if we are charitable and look at them in their best case, in only a few cases it's true that their ending is quite intrinsic to the relationship, i.e. their abuse. But we see that us as the affirmative team have proved to you that viewing this relationship through the lens of the ending is how the majority of people think about it, which proves the mood is what human nature does, and it is how we see this happening in the world. The progress of relationships can affect the end, but the end is this final result that can change how you look at it. So proud to affirm.
All right, I thank the speaker for their speech, and I thank everyone for their speech in this debate as well. With that, I invite the team to cross the floor and take stand and be out.
It's actually we are set up. One more year meeting series, sorry, absolutely legal. One thing.